Right, I'm here for another episode of Thorinquiry, and this one is going to be with Dime Dropper, who is an NBA enthusiast. He has a YouTube channel, he has a Twitter account, and what interested me about you to ask you to come on this episode, Dime Dropper, is all the time people do these GOAT debates and they compare eras. But I always say to people, like, for example, I basically watched the 90s and 2000s basketball live. And then when the internet was invented and you could go back and check old games, I watched some games from the 1980s if it was like the Lakers and the Celtics. But I don't pretend to have watched like more than YouTube highlights or maybe like one game of Wilt Chamberlain's career. And so I do think those conversations nowadays, they're like campfire stories, mate. No one even saw the games. It's all just people like, did you hear this happened? And then what about this though? So I thought what would be cool is, since you did a thread where you said you'd gone back and watched a bunch of old school games from the 60s and 70s, and then you were sort of posting literally like live thoughts as you were watching them and different observations. I thought it would be cool if I could essentially pick your brain and find out what you discovered on this adventure. So initially, just to start out with, can you give me the premise? What was the impetus to have this idea to go back? And do you have a rough number how many you've watched so far, or what the time span is?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. But secondly, it's exactly what you said. Everyone wants to have these conversations every single day about all-time this, all-time that. And I'm thinking to myself, I've been partaking in these conversations. And I see a couple of classic games here and there, but how can I accurately assess certain guys' careers, having not even watched one full playoff series of them play, relative to like a Kobe Bryant or LeBron James, who I grew up with? I've seen their entire story. One thing I've noticed is there's a big difference between hearing about greatness and then seeing the greatness. You might not be able to see it live, but when you see it in detail, full games, full context, you really get to feel just how spectacular these guys were. So what inspired me was the Last Dance documentary during COVID. And I saw that. I thought about MJ and LeBron, and I said, I've had this conversation so many times in my life, but I straight up have not watched one full series of Jordan. So how does that make me some kind of expert just because I know who he played in every single finals, just because I can name who won the championship from 1980 onwards to now? Just because I can do that doesn't mean I have an accurate knowledge of how great Jordan was relative to a LeBron or a Kobe Bryant. So I said, okay, you know what we're going to do? I'm going to try to go from 1980 onwards and watch all of Larry, Magic, and Jordan's playoff games.
Okay.
That's what I figured out was going to do. And I started watching the 1980 conference finals and finals in the West, or the Western Conference finals and the finals in 1980 during quarantine, like before the bubble had started. And I saw how spectacular Kareem and Magic and Dr. J really were. And I was like, this is so much fun. Like, you know what? If I'm going to really do this, then I need to respect the 60s and the 70s.
Okay.
If I really want to be a real historian, I need to talk about the first black superstars. And that's Bill Russell, that's Wilt Chamberlain, that paved the way. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this to another level. Since I'm starting my own podcast, I am going to do something that nobody's ever really attempted or documented to do. I'm going to start from Bill Russell's rookie year. I'm going to take every single piece of full game footage I can find, put it in a folder in order so everybody can see what I'm doing, and then make videos on those games that I'm watching to break down film for people that want to know more about these GOAT debates. So essentially, I want to help people figure out the proper order with more context. And if you don't want to watch the full games, you can just watch my content, but I also will link the full games when they're there so you can watch them as well. So it's been 3 years now almost, and I've done 15 years worth of work. I'm almost done with 1971 season. The problem is I would have been already on the 80s by now, but my process gets stagnated and stopped during the modern NBA season, which I, have multiple jobs in that. Okay. So I stopped, and it sucks because I love doing this. This is my fun. This is where I get to, just kind of learn, and I love learning. And so I've learned a lot. I'm eager to get to the 80s and 90s because that's when they say it was the golden era and all that.
Sure.
But I enjoyed doing the whole 60s, and now I'm on the 70s, and there's just a lot of cool stuff that you just don't hear about.
Right, let me ask you about a few of the players you've watched then, because obviously people will know the big stereotypes, but I want to get what was the take of actually seeing the games? How was it different? What was like what people think? So, like you said, the most obvious first name I'll ask about is Wilt Chamberlain. So if people just look up on a Wikipedia or on a stats page, obviously he has the most impossible stats ever. It looks like, I mean, it's actually one of the reasons why I know the famous inaccurate stereotype is people think he played way earlier than he did. Like they think he was like a 7 foot tall black guy and that it was all like 5 foot tall plumbers or whatever the fuck that stupid angle is. They don't seem to realize it was like a fully athletic league with all of the star players. Who was Wilt Chamberlain when you watched his games?
So the sad thing about Wilt is those seasons that he was dropping like 50 points a game, 35 points a game, they don't have even one full game, believe it or not.
Okay.
Only some highlight footage. But one thing I'll tell you about the 60s game that is so eye-opening for me was two major rules that they don't tell you about. And one of them is the way people dribbled the ball. That's the first thing that people see, especially kids my age. And you see the way they're slapping the ball down with their hand over the ball. They're not doing any fancy dribbling moves. They're not doing a bunch of crossovers. And the reason why that is because when the game was first taught at that time, the way to dribble the ball was your hand over the ball. You couldn't put your hand on the lower half of the ball. I don't even think till the late 60s you were really allowed to put your hand on the side, upper half.
It was basically illegal to do what like Steph Curry and them do, with this sort of cough it for a second, right?
Not even just Steph Curry, like literally the last 20 years of basketball, maybe even 30 years of basketball. And so the reason why it's not talked about is because there was no actual rule change that said if you put your hand on the lower side of the ball, it's now a carry or anything like that. Right. It was just kind of an interpretation that the refs ended up enforcing or not enforcing as time went on. And I think part of why is because you saw these guys that pushed the boundaries of dribbling, your Clyde Frazier's, your Earl Monroe's, then later your Magic's, even Michael Jordan, who, if you really look closely, his hands are so big, it's like he's palming the ball, basically. Yes. So, and then you have a guy like Iverson, who completely broke the sphere of what was considered legal dribbling and whatnot. And now we have guys based on the old rules carrying left and right. Yes. And it makes them more skilled. It gives them a lot more chance to create separation and to get their defenders off balance and whatnot. Like I grew up in the era where I was learning basketball post Iverson. So wide crossovers and putting your hand damn near underneath the ball was just common practice for me. That was just what was taught. What you have to understand is that's not how they were taught. So when you watch the players play and dribble the ball, what I now look at is not what kind of fancy moves they're doing. It's how tight is their handle? How secure is their handle? Right. Are people taking the ball from them? And when you really pay attention to those things, you can see who has a great handle even for that time. Because by that logic, any single person that's coming up now would have a better handle than like a Bob Cousy or someone like that. And that just doesn't really make sense. This doesn't really make sense. So that's the one rule. And then my second rule in regards to Wilt Chamberlain is that when you watch those games, you will be shocked how strict the offensive foul rules are. You literally cannot initiate contact by putting your shoulder into someone's chest, by throwing your body into someone as a guard, throwing your body into the big man to protect the shot block. These were all offensive fouls. People would not believe the calls that they make back then. It's crazy. And it just shows that the rules were much more tailored to favor the defense. Between the dribbling rules of the offense and the offensive foul thing, it was so much harder to really be a great scorer. So when you see Wilt Chamberlain and everyone says he was taller than everybody and all that, look, the average height of the NBA players now is 6'7", and it was 6'6" last year. The average height of the players in the early 60s and the whole decade of the 60s was 6'6". So at most, 1 inch difference in 6 years. But when you hear about it, just like you said, everyone tries to act like Wilt was playing against a bunch of puny guys. Yes. Now, there were maybe less 7-footers, but the thing is there were tons of great undersized centers like 6'10", including Bill Russell. But with Wilt Chamberlain, what shocks me is, one, he would still be one of the tallest people in the league right now if he was playing. And secondly, I thought he legitimately overpowered these guys his whole career because he was so strong. But when I saw that offensive foul rule, it shocked me even more how a guy who wasn't allowed to really exert his strength like a Shaquille O'Neal was, or even somebody like a Jokic does now, and he was averaging 50 points. I cannot believe that. Like, everything I've learned about Wilt, everyone tries to poke holes through his career because his stats just seem so outrageous. But studying Wilt just made me realize that even with all that, he is so undersold. He's more spectacular than I expected.
Yeah, I will even say it from a lot of the footage I saw of Wilt. The most shocking thing is, as you say, everyone just thinks it was Shaq, but in like 1960. They don't understand, like, he had finesse. Like, he was shooting fadeaways half the time, even though he's a centre. He actually had a game that's very different to, I think, how it's presented, because, like you say, it's like they make it sound like he's Godzilla. Right? What about then his obvious counterpart was Bill Russell, who won all the championships? What was your takeaway here? Because the people know the idea he's a great defensive player, but, like, for example, I know a lot of people don't know things like he was very rarely ever the one scoring the points. It was actually often usually his teams had a lot of scorers, a lot of all-time great players. What did you find out from watching Bill Russell play?
Wow. Well, I'm really happy you asked that. Bill Russell was the most enlightening part of the entire journey of the 60s, because you hear your whole career, especially me living in Los Angeles, you live in Lakerland, you hear people talk about how illegitimate those 11 championships were, how they were not playing against any teams, how the competition wasn't great, how Bill Russell had a bunch of Hall of Famers. So many inaccuracies told. So the one thing I want to start out with is the Hall of Famers thing. There are a lot of guys that didn't even make the All-Star team back then. And think about it. When the league is smaller, your percentage of making the All-Star team is higher.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But dudes aren't, like, I'm going to give a huge respect to this guy. Casey Jones, for example, who a lot of people will know of from 2K, or he was the starting point guard after Cousy. Great defensive player, but he was never an all-star, not one time.
Okay.
He's in the Hall of Fame. A lot of players that were never all-stars with Russell made the Hall of Fame for the simple fact that they were great role players on a team that was led by Russell and Red Auerbach. That was the greatest dynasty ever. So with all those rings, they made the Hall of Fame, and now people use that against Bill Russell. But they probably would have never even made the Hall of Fame if they were on another team. And that's not to disrespect them. That's just to show how great Bill Russell is. And then another fallacy is that people think that the Celtics were so much more stacked than everyone else. The fact of the matter is they had the best defender, best player, you can argue with Wilt. They had the best coach.
Russell, but yeah. You said Wilt, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they had the best player. It's either Wilt or Russell. If you consider it Russell. Right. Okay. Yeah, so they have the best player. They have Red Auerbach. They have a great supporting cast, but mainly they're just a special team that was so clutch every single year and just had a great group of guys that all respected one another. And I just think that when you look, actually not I think, I know, and this is something I found out, is that everyone says, oh, they had this many Hall of Famers and all that. Go each year by year, and take a look at how many All-Stars each team had. And when you look at it closely, you'll see that Celtics didn't have that distinct advantage over everyone else. Because when the league is only 9 to 14 teams, which it was for 8 to 14 for his whole career, every single team is going to have multiple All-Stars. That's just how it works. And with less teams in the league, you are really picking the best, 120 players in the world that you can find at that time. Of course, there were some guys for racial reasons that didn't make it.
Sure.
But for the most part, you were getting the cream of the crop. So, and then another stat about Bill Russell, 10-0 in game sevens. If it was really such an easy thing for him to win a championship, how come it went to 7 games 10 times? He came back from a 3-1 lead. No one ever mentions that. He came back from 2-1 down in a best-of-5 series. No one ever mentions that. And every single guy left, right? Sam Jones retired. Cousy retired. They said that Red Auerbach retired. They said he couldn't win with all these guys. And every single domino left, who's the one constant that still wins every single time? Bill Russell, every time. And as far as his on-court game, you said it best. I mean, he's the best defender, I think, in history, rebounder as well. But he's actually an underrated offensive player. Even though he's not your typical go-to guy, he still has some post moves, but they use him in the half-court setting in a very similar way to how the Warriors use Draymond Green, where he's often setting screens. Players are coming off the dribble handoffs and all that, coming off screens for jumpers, and he's rolling to the basket. So he's pulling the center away from the basket a lot of times and running those little screens for guys like Sam Jones, for Havlicek to free themselves up. And when they're coming off screens, if Russell's man doesn't step up, they're walking into wide open mid-range jumpers. That gives Russell the ability to crash the offensive glass or cut to the basket. And then the real key to Bill Russell's offense is the fast break and how it starts. He starts the fast break with the rebound and a quick outlet or a block, and he keeps it in bounds to start the fast break. So even though he's not the biggest scorer or whatnot, he is still a catalyst of their offense, and that begins with the defense. So everything is about Bill Russell as well. So, I mean, his resume, like, he absolutely has a GOAT case, like a strong one too, a very strong one in my eyes now.
Fair enough. Okay. What about, did you watch any of the games where Wilt played against Russell directly? Like, do you have any thoughts on that match? Because obviously people just look at the rings and they just assume Russell must have locked him up or whatever, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't think there was one full game of them playing each other. Only
right.
There was only a half, 2 separate second halves in each series. And I mean, Russell does as good of a job as you can do. He tries his best to contest the shots, but Wilt is just a monster. Like, when he catches the ball that close to the basket, you're pretty much finished. And as you said earlier, he has that turnaround over his right shoulder, especially from the left side of the court, that he loves and made his own. And I've seen Russell block it a couple of times, which is incredible to me. You have to have perfect timing for that. But for the most part, and Russell says it all the time in his books and all that, you got to just do your best against Wilt. He's one of those players, an all-time great player. You can't fully stop them. You just got to hope to contain him.
Right. One guy that I always feel like has a really weird resume is obviously got to be Jerry West, because I know to modern day players, they think like some people try to even imply the only reason he's the logo is like racism or something, you know, but I don't think they understand. Yeah, he didn't win many championships, but mate, his stats in those finals he's losing are unbelievable. Like, as far as I can tell, he must be like one of the best players ever that barely won. Like, what was this guy like in the games you got to see?
Well, another question I'm very happy you asked. Jerry West is 5 times better than every person thinks that he is that didn't watch him play. He is absolutely incredible. His pull-up jump shot is like textbook. It's faster. It's a faster release than Jordan or Kobe, and he gets almost as high as those guys. Not quite as high as Michael Jordan, because his elevation is like, I've never seen a player elevate that high on a jump shot even today.
Right.
Kobe elevated pretty nicely on his shot, but West is right around that range. He's also much taller than people think he is. People think he's like 6'2". He's like a legit 6'4", and he has really long arms, and he's super athletic. Like, I don't think
he's really fast, right?
Fast and athletic. The problem with the athleticism that people don't see is that dunking just wasn't really commonplace. Right. Not because they couldn't, but because it was considered a sign of disrespect, a non-skillful play. Remember, a couple of years after, they banned the dunk from collegiate basketball. And when my whole life, I heard that Dr. J made dunking cool. I didn't know what that meant. I was like, what is that supposed to mean? But when you really watch these games, you'll see Elgin Baylor will be on a fast break. Elgin Baylor, who has a great vertical, and he won't dunk. And that's when I realized I can understand why they said Dr. J made the dunk cool. Because when he did it, people thought this is something that is attractive to the eye. It's something that we can make part of the fabric of the sport. Jerry West, he's not dunking a lot, so people don't understand how athletic he really is. When you watch some of his blocks that I've posted and his steals, his interceptions, I mean, the guy has such quick reflexes, and just the way he moves is just very much like a modern player. But Jerry West, the one thing I learned about him besides his amazing pull-up, I mean, going right, it's like it's automatic, like straight up automatic. Obviously, going left, it's great as well. And his defense is so good. But his will to win is very not talked about enough. Everybody always looks at the finals record, but you can just listen to the way he talks about losing those finals and see how upset he is to this day. It's things that he will never get over. And he's repeated that so many times. He will never get over it. And Jerry West, a lot of those finals were not really his fault. I mean, the thing is, when you don't have a great center at that time, you're at a major disadvantage. And having to play against Bill Russell with not shorter players than him. I want to make that very clear. People act like they were just shorter than Bill Russell. They were not. He was very average height as far as centers go. They just weren't as good as him.
Right.
He was just a superstar. And back then, you really needed a superstar center to win. You'd have to go to, I think, the 75 Warriors title to find your first team without an all-time great center. Before that, Dave Cowens, Willis Reed, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell are the only centers that have really won from the 60s on, which is crazy to think about, but you needed a great center. And until they got Wilt Chamberlain, they just had a distinct disadvantage against the Celtics. But Jerry West, I mean, this guy is one of the 15 to 20 greatest players that's ever played. I mean, and watching the footage more lets me know how incredible he is. His shot making is just amazing. He'll have two guys draped all over him and he'll still hit the shots. I mean, and think about it. He's averaging 30 something points without the ability to have a crazy handle, without the ability to shoot three. He's doing all this just straight up pulling up over dudes. I mean, he's incredible.
Oh, along those lines, like a question I have more generally is, I know when people see like the crazy scoring of some of these eras in the 60s, especially where like the Wilts of the world are putting mad numbers, they always say that thing of like, oh, but it's because the pace of the game was faster. Is that accurate? Were they getting more shots? I mean, this is even before the shot clock existed, I believe. So was there a lot more pace to the game?
That's a great question. So what happened was the shot clock was introduced in, I think it was 1955.
Oh, so fair enough. Okay.
Immediately when it was introduced, people started to think, if we put up more shots, we're going to score more points. So the objective is to just get as many shots up there as possible, not really caring about shot selection. So when you watch those early 60s games or the late 50s, it's very reckless. There's a lot of turnovers. Teams are not really prioritizing shot selection. It's quick moving and passing and shots, not always great shots. So yes, it's very accurate. That's the pace is the reason why they scored so much. And also up until 1973, every single foul, people don't talk about this, every single foul.
You shoot free throw, right?
Yeah, I shoot one free throw, yeah.
Right.
People are very hesitant to reach in and be super
I see, right.
physical. And then I think it was 1969-70 season, they said loose ball fouls don't have to be shooting fouls, which was a great rule change. But I'm really happy in 1973, they're going to make it so that you have to be in the act of shooting or over the limit, because that's too much stopping of the game. But the thing is, it happens so fast, you sometimes don't even realize it, because that one free throw just happens and it's just, they move on. But yeah, the pace of the game is exactly why the game is like that, and there's so much high scoring, which makes me realize how amazing it is that those players in that time period were able to play that pace with having one trainer on their staff, sometimes no trainers, not modern surgeries, playing in Chuck Taylors. I mean, this was just right commercial, and you're playing 80 games in this pace. True. I don't understand how they did that, especially with the load management today. Like, are we calling them superhumans? I mean, what's going on here?
Yes. I mean, along those lines, like the teammate of Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, I feel like this is a player where, from some of the highlights I saw, right, there's a little thing I did on TikTok the other day where I made the point that, when everyone says that line where they're like, oh, Kobe Bryant just copied Michael Jordan's moves. I made a TikTok where I pointed out, if you ever go and look and you listen to even Michael Jordan, read his biographies, he'll tell you who he copied the moves from. Like, these are just basketball moves. So they don't know that, like, a lot of that, like, air move control movement around the basket, that's like Elgin Baylor. Obviously, he was a fan of people like David Thompson and other players, right? What was Elgin Baylor like? Did you get to see any good games of him?
Yeah, I did actually. Elgin Baylor, the thing with him is he started having knee problems very soon into the 60s. He had a resurgence, though, funny enough, in the 1968 season, where people were saying that he was going to be, actually it was 1966, I believe. His stats were really low. That was when he was majorly struggling with injuries. Then in the playoffs, he turned back the clock, and that kind of gave him this second half of his career that, while he wasn't as explosive as the first half, he was still an all-star level player up until he tore his meniscus in the 1970-71 season. But Elgin Baylor is spectacular because he's so strong. I noticed the one thing, though, he's not very good going up with his left hand. But what he does, he gets away with it because he hangs in the air so long with his right hand. So when players always say, oh, certain guys didn't have a left hand, I think it's very exaggerated at times in the 60s. They actually do better than people think. But the thing is, given the dribbling rules, they don't go to it until absolutely necessary. But Baylor gets away with it with his hang time. He's very strong, improved his jump shot over the course of his career. He's a really good rebounder. And I think the biggest thing about Baylor that I could see with the full game footage, he's a really underrated passer. Like, he's a highlight passer, a true dime dropper. And Elgin Baylor, that's one thing I'm going to post a compilation of it probably in a month or so, of Elgin Baylor's best passes, because I've just found so much footage of just like this part of his game that wasn't talked about enough. I think that's very spectacular. Elgin Baylor, and as you said, he's really the first guy we've seen with hang time, really hanging in the air that long and making it an art form, and inspired future generations of players like David Thompson, Dr. J, and MJ.
Yes. What about, I know if I'm thinking of like watching finals and stuff, I know it was at the end of his career that he won, but what about Oscar Robertson, the legendary triple-double player? I mean, there's another angle with that maybe you can enlighten me on, which is, the Westbrook season where he had the billion triple-doubles, and nowadays, like, the top players can just do whatever they want. As far as I know, there were also things like assists were counted way more harshly back then, right? Like, wasn't it something like they couldn't, like, dribble after you pass it to them or something? Can you give me some thoughts on Oscar Robertson, the triple-double?
Yeah, Oscar Robertson is another guy just like Jerry West. I can't tell you who's better, honestly. It's so hard. I don't think there's any wrong answer to that. But their careers are very intertwined because they came in the same season, 1960, and then retired in the same season, 1974. So they had the same 14-year career. Oscar is, again, way better than they tell you he is. His pull-up is also automatic, going both ways. His handle doesn't look too great and fancy, but I've never seen him lose the ball in all the games I've watched, and I've watched a decent chunk. Oscar was incredible with the Royals. He could have averaged a triple-double almost 4 seasons. There was a couple of seasons where he was just underneath, it was 9.7 assists or something along those lines. But he's a great rebounder. This is in an era where you have true big men around the basket, no three-point line, so everyone's around the basket. As you said, assists were counted differently. I don't know if it was you couldn't take a dribble. I believe you could take a dribble. I think it's like, I don't think you would get an assist for a back pass, like a drive and kick it back.
Right.
Oh, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I'd have to really sit down and calculate. All I know is I can tell you for a fact they weren't given as generously as now.
Yes.
But Oscar Robertson, I'm going to give it to you like this. He controls the game like a Chris Paul. He has that IQ. He sees everything. He can dictate the entire pace of a game. But he's got the size of I don't know who would be an accurate. I don't want to say LeBron because LeBron's just too big, but he's like 6'5", 220 or something. Like he totally bullies.
Oh, I've heard for a point guard, he has a ridiculous physique.
Yeah, he's huge. He has this size and he uses. So back then, how I was telling you about the offensive foul thing. You couldn't throw your shoulder into guys. You couldn't just bang with them in the upper body. His lower body strength. He's got this big butt. And he's got this lower body strength. He creates so much separation, and he can hit turnarounds over either shoulder. He's such a smart player. And every time I watch him play, for the most part, I just get more and more impressed with him. So when people try to say Chris Paul and I love the guys I'm about to name, I think are amazing as well. Chris Paul, Steve Nash, Jason Kidd. These guys are not on Oscar's level as players to me. Oscar is a guy that can drop 30 points any night you want. He can also get the 10 rebounds and 10 assists. And unlike Westbrook, who again is one of my all-time favorites, Westbrook is very out of control. And a lot of times he's a lot of athleticism. Oscar is a lot of skill, and he's so under control. It's like putting the triple-double nature of Westbrook with the IQ of Chris Paul together into one player and giving him 2 more inches of height too than Westbrook. I mean, Oscar is incredible. He's very undersold.
One of the things I notice is a theme that you're sort of bringing out here, and I've noticed this matches up with my experience in many sports and many competitive disciplines, is the modern fan is just thinking of the flashiest move, and so he thinks that is like skill, whereas what they don't seem to realize that you seem to be bringing out here is that the great players of old, because the rules especially were stricter, they just mastered certain fundamentals, like a certain shot or how you set it up or the mechanics. It sounds like the ones that were very good were as good as anyone now at those things, right?
Better, honestly. I can't tell you who's better at mid-ranges than Jerry West. I mean, maybe Kawhi Leonard is on his level, but not really. I mean, yeah, I don't think people are better rebounders than Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, straight up. I don't think they're better than them at dribbling. I'm sorry, at rebounding. I really don't. And yeah, it's facts. I think what you're saying, just I think the big takeaway is that you need to be, whatever era you play in, you need to be better than the other guy next to you. That's really what it is. Whatever those rules are, you need to put in more work, be more skilled, more talented. And the one thing that translates to every sport and every era is your confidence. And that's the one thing in sports that people just don't talk about enough. Sports are a human activity. It's not a bunch of robots playing. You need to have the confidence. That basketball instincts translate to any era. And when I see Oscar Robertson just be one step ahead of everybody else, John Havlicek, one step ahead of everybody else, what makes me think that they wouldn't be one step of everybody else now? Because it's really it's a man-to-man thing. Yes. Yeah, you have more players playing now. It's a global pool. I understand. But You're better than the guy next to you because you just have that it factor. And a lot of these players just have that it factor, but with their skill. And yeah, I do agree that some of them do things, the things that they do it as well, if not better, than the modern players. And obviously some things they do worse, but it's all about being great in the game that you are given and learning. It's like when people say, oh, what would Steph Curry be without a three-point line? Who cares? He didn't grow up without a three-point line. Bill Russell, oh, what would he do now? Why would it matter what he does 60 years later? 60 years. It doesn't really matter. What he did was he beat everybody because he was just that kind of guy.
Yes. I mean, it's a similar thing I was thinking about recently where when everyone rightfully so is celebrating how amazing Jokic is, when I watch some of those passes, mate, I just think, mate, imagine what Larry Bird would do in this era when you're shooting threes all the time, you can pass, it's wide open spacing, mate, he'd be having a field day, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing it's just a fact, is offense has gotten easier. That's what the league wants, though. This is what the league wants. It's not even worth arguing.
No, they've basically said as much in most interviews. If you go and listen to even the commissioner, they'll just admit that they changed the game that way.
Exactly. But defensively, it's harder now because there's so much space to cover. You can't put your hands on players as much. So in that sense, I do respect the guys that still go out there and play defense. They would be better defenders if they played in the past, to me.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. What about this then? I don't want to I'm not trying to trip you up here. Like, I understand there's not that much footage. I've tried searching myself over the years on the different sites, etc. So if any of these names are ones you haven't seen much of, just let me know. But an old school name that I notice is, I like to be a little historian and look up the old players as well. A name no one in the modern day ever mentions, mate, is that player Bob Pettit. But he seemed really good when I saw him.
So this is a sad one, unfortunately. With Bob Pettit, there's not one full game that exists. There's not even one full half that exists. Wow. I've tried to watch everything I can, and the only thing I can tell you is he has a great jump shot, and he's a fierce rebounder, and he's very strong. And he was probably the best player in the NBA before Bill Russell came. And I think he's just off the simple, even though I can't really properly rank him relative to some of the other great power forwards because he didn't have the film, he's definitely he's without a doubt a top 10 power forward with the numbers he put up. He was an all-star every year. And he beat the Celtics. I know Bill Russell was injured for 2 of those games, but he beat the Celtics and dropped like 50 points in a closing game to do it. Like, that deserves my respect right then and there.
Yes. Right. Obviously, a name I haven't talked about yet because it's more edging at the end of this era of players we were discussing is obviously Kareem, or Lou Alcindor as he came into the league. What was this player like? Because I also feel like he's a player where the difference is, mate, people think they know Kareem because they saw the Magic era Lakers. But I always tell people, dude, go look how old he is. Like, he's already in his 30s by the time Magic gets there. Like, what was the old Kareem, like the original one?
Oh, well, since I'm on the 1971 season, I've only seen his first 2 seasons, but
I've heard he just tears up even those first seasons though, right? Isn't he like the best player immediately?
He is. I've never seen anybody like this guy, even to this day. I mean, he's got such good touch, such grace in the way he moves. And he's also like this gazelle athlete, like 7'2" with skill, great touch around the basket. Obviously the hook shot, but I don't need to keep going on about that because that's all everybody talks about with him.
Yes.
So I don't really want to talk about that with him because I know he has the hook shot. That's obvious. But he has the counters to that when people are, because he loves to take the hook shot turning over his left shoulder. But when people really are sitting on that left shoulder, he'll just spin the other way. What's amazing about him is his agility, his rim protection. But I think one thing that's super underrated about Kareem is his passing, whether it's out of the post or the main skill I hope to showcase for everybody one day, how great he is at this, his outlet pass. Only Kevin Love is the only player in the NBA to me now that can compare to this, his outlet passing. I mean, this guy, Kareem, he's one of the best players I've ever seen. He's unlike any player I've ever seen. I mean, it's been 50 plus years and we've still not seen a player like that. And that's the most amazing thing is Wilt, Bill Russell, Kareem, even Oscar Robertson, we've never had another player like this. You can say that these guys are like the new iterations of them, but they're unique in their own ways too. We've never seen a player like Kareem. He comes into an expansion Milwaukee Bucks team that won 25 games or something in their first year of existence. Immediately in their first season, he gets them to 55 wins, if I'm not mistaken. It's over 53 wins. 55 wins, takes them to the conference finals and then loses Then the second he gets Oscar Robertson, the next year he wins the championship. And by year 2, he's consensus the best player in the world. You could even make the argument that year 1, he was the best player in the world. I mean, statistically, it looks like he is.
Yes.
The only thing I'll say is I'll give guys like Willis Reed and Wilt some experience. But in 71, it's not really debatable. Kareem becomes the clear-cut best. He stamps it off with an MVP and a finals MVP and just dominates. That Bucks team was just dominant. So Kareem is just, again, another player. You hear about him your whole life. He's still underrated to me.
You know, I don't know. Did you watch that show where they made that sort of like TV series, which was semi-fictional, semi-right, about the 1980 Lakers? Did you watch that one? I think it was Winning Time or something, right?
Funny enough that you ask. I actually had Spencer Garrett that plays Chick Hearn on my podcast.
Oh, that's cool. Because there was one thing in that show. I know some people think it's a bit cheesy because it is just a TV show. But one thing I thought was quite cool, like a little touch they put in that, was when they have that part where Kareem is explaining what it's like to basically like shoot all those sky hooks and like basically essentially you almost can't be guarded. And he's just talking about how when he's above the basket, you know, he's just like deciding when to throw it in. It's like they make it sound, mate, like he's like a Greek god compared to everyone else. And that he's just like playing his own game basically because essentially the premise is like it's not really defense for players like that, right?
Oh, definitely not. I mean, you can try to double team him, but if you double team him, when he's on the baseline, what's really hard is when you double team him from the top of the key, he literally just turns to the baseline over that left shoulder and he still gets the shot off. Like it's an amazing counter to being double teamed. But yeah, I mean, there's not much you can do. The best thing you can do with Kareem is, here's what I would do is, and I want to see how much people exploit this later down the line, but you got to push him as far away from the basket as you can. Be very physical with him off the ball. Nate Thurmond was one of the players that I've really learned about in the Golden State Warriors back then. He's really good at this because he's so strong. And then you want to try to sit on his left shoulder and make him spin over his right so he can prevent the sky hook. What happens is he's so tall and has such long arms that if he spins over the shoulder and you're leaning too far on one side, he could just have a layup right then and there. But you got to throw multiple bodies at him. I think I haven't gotten there yet, but I remember watching it briefly one time. And I think a good game to watch to see how teams really want to defend Kareem well is 1974 finals, game 7. It's Boston versus Milwaukee. It's a game 7 of the finals. No one talks about it. But the way they're guarding Kareem is crazy. Like they're just throwing so many bodies at him. Cowens is trying to be really physical with him. So those are the best ways I would say to guard him. But in terms of one-on-one, yeah, you got to just pray he misses.
Right, you mentioned him earlier, but obviously one of the people that everyone will have thought about recently when some of the talk shows have dared to invoke the past is Bob Cousy. Because if you ask like a modern day fan who knows nothing about the old school, they immediately think of like Bob Cousy. They think, oh, it's like a little like white guy and he was just sort of like dribbling in a really like janky way. And it's like, come on, man, he'd get destroyed now. Like everyone knows the old JJ Redick thing recently. What would you tell me about a player like this? I mean, you already gave some points about the dribbling aspect, the fact defense is better. Like as much as it might look weird, put it this way, no one's taking the ball off these guys, right?
Yeah, I never saw Bob Cousy lose the ball. I've seen a lot of extended highlights of his games, but there was only one full game, and that was his last game as a player in the league, game 6 of the 63 finals. I think with Kuz, he gets underrated because he was the first best point guard of all time. Like he was the first one everybody talked about. And yeah, his handle is, hand on top of the ball. You don't see him dribbling with his left hand too much, but when you watch the full footage, he does when he needs to when teams make him go that way. I think Kuz and his field goal percentage, people will talk about as well. Obviously, a lot of that is era dependent as well. As I said, teams didn't really prioritize shot selection as much. But Cousy, his passing is otherworldly. I mean, he's to this point, I would even put him over Oscar in that respect where I'm at. I think he's the best passer of all time up to 1971. And he probably will end up being the best passer of all time until Magic comes around. I mean, he's got such flair, especially on the break. He's thrown some passes I've never seen anyone throw to this day. And also, yeah, he might not be the best scorer, but when I watched that game 6 of the 1963 finals, it's the full game is there. He was hitting hook shots with his left hand. What player in the NBA is doing that now? 1, 0. So again, it goes back to that conversation of confidence and feel of the game. Bob Cousy, yeah, he's not better than Oscar Robertson. I wouldn't even put him over Clyde Frazier, but he's an all-time great because his passing is tier 1 in terms of anybody in NBA history. He's right on that tier, and he still does things where you see just how much skill he really had. Like he was a very skilled player. And again, thought one step ahead of his peers. And that makes me believe that in any era, he'd be great, because that's the main thing, is the mental game. He has the skill back then, and he has the mental game. That's the part that translates better than anything. So Bob Cousy is insanely disrespected. And my biggest problem with the Reddit comments is he made it seem like just because Bob Cousy dominated the 50s, which was still not very integrated, it was very white. It's what people think the 60s was.
Yes.
Then they think that, oh, he dominated the 50s, he's weak. But he also was an all-star when Oscar was in the league, when Jerry was in the league, when Russell, Sam Jones, Wilt were all in the league. So it's not just the competition. He would be great playing against those guys because he was great playing against those guys. So when Reddick makes that comment, it makes it seem like he never played against players like Jerry West and Oscar Robertson. Yes. And that sells him short. And I have a huge problem with that.
Yeah, along those lines, I forget who it was, but it could have even been you. I remember someone made a tweet thread that was along the lines of what you were talking about, where they said this whole idea there was ever an era beyond maybe when it was just racially segregated, where like, you know, every player sucked and it's like, you know, there's a certain cutoff date like that. This is when it really starts. They said the reason that doesn't actually make sense is if you ever look at all the great players in history, collectively they all overlap with each other. Like someone like that at the end, like you say, Oscar Robertson comes in. Then when Oscar Robertson's about to go out, then someone like Magic Johnson or Dr. J comes in, and then after them comes in Michael Jordan. And what you see by the fact that these players can coexist is the level can't have been so insane. Like it wasn't really like one guy was twice as tall and the other guy was half as fast. Like the actual level of athleticism and skill has to be fairly consistent throughout most of these decades, right?
Yes, that's the biggest thing I have is, well, I'll say this. In the 60s, there's not as many high flyers as now. But again, dunking wasn't as prioritized. But you sure as hell have a lot of guys whose endurance is just incredible. I mean, I don't believe, and this is my honest opinion, it's nothing, you can't prove it, but I honestly don't think that Joel Embiid could last in the 60s playing 82 games at this pace with how he gets injured. I don't think he can do it. I think he would get banged up too much, and he would just, and I don't want to say that to discredit Embiid. I'm just saying that it's a different level of athlete back then. I'm not saying they're better athletes, but I'm just saying they're different athletes, and their endurance is incredible. Less bulky. Weightlifting wasn't really a big thing for them back then. It was believed to have affected your jump shot. So I think in like the early 90s, people started really lifting weights like that. And that's a big part of things too. Because again, if they were told that that's BS, because it is, because nowadays you see guys like Desmond Bain on the Memphis Grizzlies who looks like a NFL player. Sure. and he can shoot threes as well as anybody. So, you know, weightlifting and affecting your shot, that's not really true. But back then it was believed to be true. And plus, what people don't realize is, what's the point of being super big in an era where you're literally running up and down the court?
Yes, you have to carry all the muscle, right? Yeah, sure.
Exactly. And that's what they asked Kareem about his first game. I have the video on my channel. They asked Kareem about do you think that, you know, Walt Bellamy weighs 20 more pounds than you? How do you think you'll be able to compete? And he said, well, I'll have less weight to carry. So I actually don't think it's as big of a disadvantage as you say. And I mean, those comments aged pretty well because Kareem ended up being pretty damn good. But God, I forgot what you were saying. Oh, the overlap part.
Yes.
Yeah. I saw that same tweet. I forget who posted it. Probably one of my good followers or good followers or people I follow. But I'm gonna just say this. Bob Cousy played with Jerry West and Oscar Robertson. Jerry West and Oscar Robertson played with Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain played with Kareem. Kareem played with Magic. Magic played with Jordan. Jordan played with Kobe. Kobe played with LeBron. LeBron plays with Zion Williamson. Every single one of these players is that there's an overlap here. John Havlicek played against Dr. J. So when everybody says, oh, look at this unathletic white dudes like Rick Barry and John Havlicek, Dr. J is maybe one of the 10 most athletic players that's ever played in the NBA. And he's playing against those guys and not killing them like people think. So again, it's so many inconsistencies, and they're so ignorant. They're not even willing to just look at how wrong they are.
You just mentioned a name there I definitely want to ask you about. So whenever people talk about like the great shooters like Steph Curry's of the world now, I always tell them, guys, you guys need to go and look up the YouTube highlights of Rick Barry. Like this guy was a fucking stud shooter.
Oh man, Rick Barry, he is another player that's way better than people think.
He's mega, isn't he?
Every single place he goes, he averages 30 plus points. And he's not just a shooter. He's just an all-world scorer. So his first season, he comes into Golden State, 65, 66, and he averaged like near 30 points, I think. The following season, he averaged over 30. I have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. And then they went to the championship. His second season, played against the Sixers. That was the year that Philly broke Boston's 8 championship in a row streak. And that 67 Sixers team it's one of the all-time great teams that doesn't get talked about. Wilt won his championship that eluded him. But then what was crazy was, and Barry, by the way, averaged like 35 points in that finals. He shot a lot, but he still averaged like 35 points. What happened was after he took a role with the Oakland Oaks of the ABA, who offered him more money at the time.
Right.
So imagine this. Imagine a young player, second year in the league, just led his team to the championship and lost. You're thinking you're going to compete. You're going to take over the Lakers now that Jerry West and Elgin are getting old. And he jumps ship to the ABA. And funny enough, he averaged 30 points there too. And then he comes back and averages 30 again. Like, this guy, wherever he went, he could score. He's also an underrated rebounder and passer, very much, and a very underrated athlete, I might add. I mean, his son did win the dunk contest in 1996, Brent Barry, but Rick Barry's got great bounce as well. He moves well. He's pretty tall, and he has that ability to get shots up over the top of guys. And one thing, he actually has a lot of similarities to Kobe in ways, in the sense that the 1, 2, 3 pump fakes, lean and shoot over guys with dudes draped all over him. I saw that when watching the film, and I'm like, man, that's very Kobe-like to me, because Kobe was the player that I grew up with in my time being in LA. So, but Kobe has a lot of Rick Barry in his game. And I think Rick Barry is, like, I know people talk about Scottie Pippen as one of the best small forwards of all time. But Scottie Pippen's not better than Rick Barry. I mean, he was a great second option, but he's not that type of guy that's going to go out there and average 30 points. Rick Barry is not a second best player on any team that he plays on. I think people need to realize that. Rick Barry will never be a second best player because he's that good. And so he's definitely one of the best small forwards of all time. I think his reputation off the court may hurt him.
He's a bit spicy, right?
Yeah. I mean, he made comments like when the team relocated from Oakland to Washington, D.C., he was like, if I wanted to go to D.C., I'd run for president. And then when they moved to Virginia, it became the Virginia Squires, which Dr. J eventually ended up debuting for. He said, I don't want to move my kids to the South. I don't want them growing up with Southern accents and saying y'all and stuff like that. So then he got traded to the New York Nets.
He's almost like a wrestling heel here, just insulting all the home crowd.
Yeah, so Rick Barry, I mean, people might hold that against him, but talent-wise, I mean, he's up there with the best small forwards ever played, with Baylor, with Havlicek.
You know, one thing I'd love to ask you about, you were talking about how much harder it is, both like how much better defense can be basically, but also how hard like it is offensively. There's so many fouls you can commit. There's so many more things you get away with now. The one thing that I do actually feel really sad about, all the nephews grown up now, think they know everything about the NBA, is their idea of what normal scoring is so warped out of shape. It's insane, mate. Like, remember, I told you I grew up in the 90s. If someone can average 20 points a game, they are a fucking stud in the 90s. In the modern day, they think like 20 points a game's nothing. They think, you know, people should be dropping 40, 50-point games left, right, and center. What would you say to this? How much different was scoring back then?
So different. I think, well, here's the thing, though. In the 60s, it's not as different as people think because of the pace. So it actually, you can say, if you want to compare them to the 90s or the 2000s, you can say it's inflated to a degree. My thing is this. You just got to be able to contextualize. That's the problem. When people look at a guy like, let's say Kobe, because he played from 1996 to 2016. From 1996 to 2012, some of the lower scoring eras in the history of basketball. So his career numbers are not going to look as good as, say, Luka Doncic, who started playing in 2018. It's like Luka Doncic's career scoring average is going to be higher than Kobe's probably. Is he a better scorer than Kobe? For me, no shot. Zero. But I mean, the scoring numbers, you got to contextualize it. 20 is, what's the word? 30 is the new 20 in today's game. It is the new 30. And when you have guys, and this is not to disrespect NBA players, because I think it's very hard to have 50 points in an NBA game is extremely hard in any era, no matter what.
Yes.
But when you got so many role players dropping 50 and 40, it just takes away the value of that. Like, we had 2 players drop 70 this year. Are you trying to make me believe that Donovan Mitchell and Damian Lillard are that much better than all the guys I watched when I was a kid? I don't think so. They're amazing, though. I love Damian Lillard, and I think Donovan Mitchell's a beast. But it's not the same as when I watched Kobe have 81 points in 2006 with 2 real big men playing against him. Like, that was ridiculous. I still remember where I was that night. And I just think, as you said, people need to contextualize it. I'm okay if people agreed that scoring now is easier and that you can't compare numbers directly to certain eras, but the ignorant ones choose not to. And that's where you just can't have a discussion. You can't just compare numbers like Steph Curry's numbers to Jerry West side by side. It just doesn't work like that. So as long as you know how to contextualize, I have no issue with admitting that it's easier to score those points now.
You know, another thing I also thought I'd ask you about is I also feel like when people talk about things like scoring and how easy it all is and all the rest of it, like one other problem is if they're looking up an old player and they're just watching a highlight footage of his skills, well, he's not missing any shots there. You're not seeing the game flow. Like there's certain players, like an obvious one to me, I grew up in this guy's era, was Allen Iverson. If you watch an Allen Iverson highlight clip where he never misses a shot, you're going to think he's the best player ever, mate. He looks unbelievable. But in a real game, he could definitely chuck sometimes. Obviously, he's a small guy. He wouldn't always be able to get into the paint and score the ball. Or there's a reason why he was a very good player, but he wasn't the best a lot of the time, What would you say to something like this? Because I feel like I can tell the players they're only watching the amazing YouTube highlight of,
Oh, I am big on team full games. You gotta watch the full games because, as you said, highlights don't move me. You're only seeing the good of someone. I could make a highlight tape of myself right now and look really good too. So it's, as you said, highlights do not do them justice. And plus, one of the biggest things I think is funny is when people try to discredit defense by showing a player's offensive highlights and be like, what kind of defense was that? Is that the insanely physical defense they talk about back in the day? Why would anybody try to use a player's offensive highlights as an example to talk about good defense? You know what I'm saying? Like naturally, if you put a highlight reel of anyone, it's not going to be the best defense. Of course, sometimes they'll make some contested shots here and there that will be well defended, but there's going to be some moments of bad defense there naturally when people score in the game of basketball. So the full games you have to watch. The highlights do not do anyone justice, and that's where the wow factor comes more in for me. And that's why I love doing this, because when you watch the full games, you just see certain things you'll never see in the highlights. Like I would have never known that Kareem was such a good outlet passer if I had watched only highlights. I would have never known how good of a passer Elgin Baylor was if I had just watched the highlights. A player like Dave Bing, for example, I don't even know if you've heard of him, but I watched the full game of him. He was insane. And of course, in highlights, you can maybe tell.
Yeah,
having that factor of, I have no idea what's about to happen, and seeing it, like there'll be times I'm even watching 60s games, I'll jump out of my chair. I'll be like, oh my God, that was incredible. And those are the best parts about it. It feels like I'm really watching these things for the first time, even though I was literally born in 1998, and this happened 20 to 30 years before I was even alive. But when I'm doing it in chronological order, it gives me a lens that I can somewhat see what it was like for those people. And here's the crazy part. Back then, yeah, you were consuming the news as it was happening, but they weren't really watching that many more games than I can watch right now.
That's true.
Broadcasting in America back then, basketball was so minimal. You were lucky to get one or two games.
Yes.
If it wasn't your local, sometimes your local games would be on the radio more often than not. So it's crazy that I feel like I can kind of talk not as well, but close enough that you can feel like I know as much as people that were there. And I think that's the most enlightening thing of all.
You mentioned earlier the narrative that it wasn't that all the Celtics teams were just stacked. They weren't like they just had like five, it wasn't like an all-star team and that was just why they were winning all the time, right? Obviously, as you say, the player aside from Bill Russell, that is the big name, is obviously John Havlicek, is another player that's it. Like if you're making lists of all the best players at positions, this is someone who's going to get forgotten by they're going to put a million people from the 90s, the 2000s. How good was this guy?
Oh, you're asking the best questions. Okay, so John Havlicek, in my opinion, and I stand by this strong, of all the players I learned about in this process so far, he's the most underrated star that's ever played in the NBA. People don't understand how amazing this guy was. Just check the minutes that he played. He lasted 16 years playing 40-plus minutes in so many seasons in the 60s with none of these modern surgeries, all the stuff I talked about earlier. This guy, in the similar way of, he had a similar trajectory to Kawhi Leonard in the sense that he came into a really good team that had already won championships. He was a sixth man. And then he ascended into being part of the dynasty. And then when the guy, Bill Russell, retired and Tim Duncan retired for San Antonio, they ascended into becoming superstars. John Havlicek is the best player on at least, and I emphasize the at least part, at least 2 championship teams. Because the last 2 championships that Russell won, he may not have been the best player. Statistically, it doesn't support him. You'd have to watch the games, and maybe his defense was so good still that it weighed higher than everything else. But John Havlicek, you can make a strong case, was the best player on the 68 and 69 teams. And of course, he was the best player on that 73 team and 74 team and 76. The thing about Havlicek is he's not a great ball handler, even for his time. It improved, but he's not a great ball handler, even for his time. But he's literally amazing at every other aspect of the game. Great shooter. Pull up going right, automatic. Going left, not as much. If he has space, he can hit it. Finishing around the basket, really good. Amazing in transition. Amazing. Like a perfect player to have on the fast break. But he does all the little things that help you win games. Dive on the floor for a loose ball. Guard your best player. Hustle for a rebound. And the main thing with Hondo, he's so clutch. Everybody knows about Havlicek stole the ball in 1965, but he's had so many other moments like that where when they need a big game, he brings it. And the thing about Havlicek more than anything too is he never gets tired. Apparently he had like some abnormally big lung capacity or something. Like he never got tired. And he also could have played he was playing football at Ohio State in college. Like this is a 2-sport athlete, and I think he's so amazing. You look at the numbers he put up with and without Russell. But my favorite John Havlicek stat is in the 1969 finals against the Lakers with Wilt, Jerry, and Elgin Baylor. Bill Russell and John Havlicek didn't sit out 1 second of the entire series, and it went 7 games. They played every single minute. That is unfathomable to someone like myself that grew up now. Unfathomable. He's just the man. And I'm a huge fan of John Havlicek. He's also a great passer, and I've made a couple of videos that involve him. And I stand by that. He's the most underrated star in the history of the game. I'd even go as far as to say you can compare him to Elgin Baylor and Rick Barry. I think Elgin Baylor is much more famous, especially where I'm from. But if you really look at their careers, the thing about Elgin Baylor is the chances that he had to potentially get over the hump, he just fell short. And part of it is his fault. John Havlicek, every time it was there for the taking, he seemed to pull through. And I think John Havlicek has a great case to be a top 5 small forward ever. I really stand by that. He's that underrated and he's that good. And I'm really thankful that you asked me about him.
What about this? You've picked some players there where, like, most times when people say underrated or overrated, they usually mean, like, underrated. They mean someone you've never heard of who was actually good or whatever. You're doing quite a good case picking people who are very big names, but maybe people don't really understand what their game was like, or they are mad underrated in certain areas. Can you give me, like, another name that you think from either 60s, 70s you think was just really underrated? Like, this guy was a monster, but maybe he just doesn't get mentioned, or people just don't even understand how good he was?
Yeah, I can give you a couple. One is Sam Jones from the Celtics. He passed away last year, but he won 10 championships. I felt so bad that he had no real highlight reels. So I took it upon myself to make the longest Sam Jones highlight reel on the internet. And before he passed away, it was around 200 views. And when he did pass away, sadly, it was a plus from that happening, but obviously devastating to hear him pass away. But the views jumped to 11,000. So if you look up Sam Jones Celtics on YouTube right now, my video will come up. And this guy, you want to talk about really good pull-up jump shots and great in transition. He checks off all the boxes. The main thing about Sam Jones, and Bill Russell will tell you this if you listen to him talk, is every time, and it checks out by doing my research, every time the season was in jeopardy, like I mentioned those 10-0 in game 7s for Bill Russell, this guy made the big shot every time. Every time. He's one of the clutchest players that's ever lived. He was the best scorer in a lot of those teams. I think he has a great case to maybe be a top 10 shooting guard ever. He's just a fantastic player, and I think no one talks about him. And then another couple of guys I would name, Nate Thurmond and Gus Johnson. These are 2 guys that went to high school in Akron, Ohio, which became famous for another player later and down the line, LeBron. But Nate Thurmond and Gus are these 2 Greek god-looking figures. Nate Thurmond is like this jacked center. He played for the Warriors. his whole career, basically. His first year, he actually played with Wilt in the 63-64 San Francisco Warriors. But Kareem has gone on to say, and he's a center, Kareem has gone on to say that it's the best defender he's ever played against in his entire career. And when you see the numbers when Kareem plays him and they drop, you can see that checks out. He's insanely strong. The only thing about Nate Thurman that sucks is we just don't have many full games of him. I only have one so far from his first 8 years. Amazing outlet passer, rebounder, shot blocker. He looks like a guy that would have SportsCenter highlights every night. And then Gus Johnson is a guy that no one talks about.
Yes.
6'7", 240 pounds from Akron, Ohio, can do a little bit of everything. I know that sounds very familiar, but he really was like a LeBron before LeBron in his own way. He had these fancy passes, and there's an amazing compilation if you want to see who I'm talking about. Wilt Chamberlain Archive, who's an amazing YouTube channel.
I actually did an interview with him on this channel. He's mega, yeah.
Really? You got an interview with Wilt Chamberlain Archive?
Yes.
Oh, I'm going to have to check that out then. But Gus Honeycomb Johnson, he posted a nice 7-minute video of him, and you could just see how spectacular he was. His athleticism, his strength. This is a guy that's not even lifting weights looking like that. And then his rebounding. He's also one of the best defenders of his era and can score like 18 points every single night. And his passing is one thing that really sticks out about all these players is they were such better passers than anyone realizes. I think that it was a fundamental skill that was emphasized more. Nowadays, yeah, there's a lot of good passers in the league, but a lot of them, you see they're passing because they're getting so much attention as scorers and they have to pass. These guys are just learning it because it's part of their, I guess, their basketball curriculum growing up. But those two players are two players that I just think don't get their respect. And I think also a lot of players from those Hawks teams, St. Louis Hawks, the ones post Bob Pettit, like Lenny Wilkins, Zelmo Beatty, who I think is the most underrated player in basketball history. Bill Bridges, even Marvin Bagley from the NBA now.
Yes,
he has a grandpa, Joe Caldwell, Pogo Joe. He was on those Hawks teams. He's a good athlete, all-star a couple of times. So those players, I would say, stick out. And then Willis Reed, who just passed away a couple of years ago, one of the best centers to ever play the game. He is criminally undersold. He might be the best Knick of all time. That Knicks team in the late 60s, early 70s is just incredible to watch. But those are some names. I listed too many, but also earlier, but Dave Bing, the first Pistons star, he was like a Damian Lillard kind of player for his era in terms of the flash and the ability he had.
Right, I notice in this interview, in fact, in general, it's obviously why you're interested in history. You've been very respectful to a lot of the names, a lot of the players. So I'll be very careful how I ask this. But from watching old games, were there any players that actually felt like they're overrated from the old days? Is there anyone you watched and you were like, oh, I was expecting him to be a bit more dominant, or he's just a very good player? Was there anyone that seemed like they got a bit too gassed up?
That's a great question. I would say this. Wilt Chamberlain's footage doesn't do him the most justice because we don't see him as the 50-point scorer that we always hear about, that 62 season. We just don't see enough of that. So I'd say from the footage, if you're only watching the footage, you can say Wilt's overrated, but I know he's not. So as far as someone that maybe let me down, I would say this. Okay, I wouldn't say any of the stars, but I would say the players like the Bill Russell Hall of Fame guys that everybody was like, oh, Bill Russell has all these Hall of Famers. Yes. I'm looking at them play and I'm like, these guys are decent. They're nothing crazy. Like Frank Ramsey or even a guy like, I wouldn't say Satch Sanders, Tom Sanders, their power forward was overrated at all. But he was a good role player. You know what I'm saying? Like he wasn't anything insane that gave Bill Russell this distinct advantage that he had. But no, I honestly wouldn't say that anybody has been overrated to me. I would say this, Wes Unseld, I thought he was a better scorer than he was. But he's not a worse player than I thought he was. I think, you know what it is I think for this question, you would have to go more towards the 80s and 90s because the 60s and the 70s players just don't get any respect. That's true. So it's hard for me to say any of them are overrated. Yes. You know?
Yes, I mean, put it this way, along those lines, I didn't ask because it was in theory in the spot where you didn't say if you'd watched the games as much, but I actually do think, mainly because he played in the ABA as well, I think Dr. J is mad underrated, mate. All the footage I've seen of him, he is unbelievably good. Like, even when people go back, I don't think they know how many playoff series he even played in the NBA. This guy was a stud. He's just a flat-out scorer.
Well, the Doc is, I have a personal bias towards him because I went to the same college as he did, UMass. So, I mean, and my uncle's favorite player was Dr. J, even back when he was in Iran before he moved to the States. Yeah, no, Doc and I, like, I mean, That I could have a whole episode on him. I haven't gone to. You know what's funny is he's coming into the league the next season that I'm doing, and I'm about to start.
Right.
I want to say 2 weeks time. I'll start the 71-72 season. He's going to be in the ABA for a while. The ABA is pretty loaded with a lot of talent right now too. So that's another thing. The players that played in the ABA are the most underrated because no one talks.
Well, what we'll have to do is we'll have to do a future episode. You can tell me about some of those players for sure, because there'll be some there I've never looked into. I've no doubt.
Oh yeah, and I love these discussions. These are the ones that I have fun. I mean, everybody always asks me to talk about the Clippers because that's my team that I cover and stuff, and the modern NBA. And like, yeah, I mean, those are fun too, but there's nothing like doing this. Like you're letting me talk about how great Jerry West and John Havlicek and Oscar Robertson are for 2 minutes at each. And I mean, this is what I've done it for. Like, I want to be able to be asked these questions, and I want to be able to answer them as if I were there. And I feel like I can do that very strongly now. I can't wait to do that with the other players. And Doc, I mean, remember when I told you in the beginning of the show that I started out by watching the 1980 only?
Yes.
I finished that finals and conference finals, and then I stopped and went back. So I never proceeded. But I got to watch the finals with Dr. J against the Lakers. And despite the fact that you can say that he maybe underperformed a little bit toward the end when when Kareem got hurt and Magic just kind of shocked everybody, some of the things that guy does, like people think like, oh, everyone does these kind of things now. Like he was the first of this is one thing I actually hate when people say he was ahead of his time, because it makes it seem like nowadays he's just as good as everyone else. Hell no. There are players there's nobody that does layups like Doc. None, zero. And the way that he palms the ball, like Kawhi Leonard doesn't have quite as big of hands as Dr. J, believe it or not. But everybody talks about Kawhi's hands. He doesn't use it the same way as Doc does offensively. Doc, like, he holds that ball out like it's an orange. And the things that he does, at least once per game, he'd get me out of my seat, at least. So I can only imagine what it was like growing up watching this guy, especially because, yes, he was the first of his kind, dunking like that and all that. But a player that actually was like Dr. J a little bit before him was Connie Hawkins. He's a player that gets really under talked about because he got blackballed in college. So he didn't actually get to in his prime years were taken away from him. So he had to go to the ABA before they finally let him go to the Suns in 1969-70.
I think this is actually a player I heard Dr. J talk about. Was he on his team?
No, but he looked up to him because he's big hands, super athletic. He's even bigger than Doc. And he was really spectacular. But the big thing with Connie is a lot of those young prime athleticism years were taken away because he was blackballed because of this point shaving scandal in college that a lot of New York basketball players got hit with. But Doc, as you said, he's so spectacular. And when people try to like act like he's just ahead of his time, like, no, you put him in today and he's still doing things that you just don't see.
Right. Obviously, I'll be careful how I phrase this, because actually one thing I do despise about modern conversations is that it does just sound like little kids in the playground, like, my dad beat your dad up. No, he wouldn't beat you up. It's like they're not even really talking about the players. So if I say, is LeBron overrated, people are going to think like, yeah, defraud, he's shit. They're going to do all that, which I don't think at all. He's obviously an amazing player. But my question is this, being as he's the one who, there was all the hype around him being the top scorer all time. Obviously, people think he should have won the MVP every season, apparently, if they're fans of his. He is one of the greatest players. But if you notice, the discussion in the modern day goes like this. It's like, it's Michael Jordan, LeBron, and forget everyone else in history. So essentially, is LeBron overrated in the sense that people act like so many of the old great players are sort of irrelevant compared to him?
Yes. I cannot emphasize that enough. This whole thing that started they obviously were comparing LeBron to Jordan in the hopes that he would be as great as him or as successful from the moment he was drafted. And to credit LeBron, he has exceeded every single expectation. The fact that he surpassed Kareem, are you kidding me? That's amazing. And I was a childhood LeBron fan, believe it or not. Like, he was my favorite player when I was a kid. But it's this exact conversation that's made me turn a little sour. And that's because all the people associated with him or his fandom, all they do is they want to talk about these two players, and everyone else, you're a tier below.
Yes.
That's not what my eyes tell me. That's not what the resume tells me either. And so when you actually listen, and this is the best way to prove my point, when you listen to actual NBA players and actual media members that have lived through the 80s and prior, not 90s and on, 80s and prior, I specifically laid that cutoff, their lists will look a lot more diverse. But if you talk to somebody from the 90s on, they almost feel peer pressure, like socially engineered to say LeBron and Jordan are 1 and 2, and then the list starts. And I just don't believe that, because I, as a journalism major myself, I know the inconsistencies that they use. And the main inconsistency was that they pushed this narrative really, really hard. It took it to the next level after LeBron won championship number 3 in Cleveland after coming back from 3-1 down. And there are 2 reasons why I believe that. One, because I guess that was just an amazing ring. It really was.
Sure, yeah.
And it gave him a stronger case. But to me, if LeBron it's LeBron and Michael Jordan after his 3rd championship, then that would mean that Larry Bird and Magic Johnson should absolutely have GOAT cases too. At that point, LeBron only played 13 seasons. That's as many as like Larry and Magic played anyway. So now Kareem and Kobe Bryant and Shaq and all these guys just get tossed to the side. I don't believe that. But what I do know is this: the media's goal is to make money. The media's goal is to get people talking. And there's nothing that gets people talking more than just comparing these 2 guys. You shorten people's attention span by only making it about 2 guys, one current player and one past. People won't look at anything else. And now you are selling the fact that you have a guy that might be the best player ever in your league. And when we know is LeBron gets views.
Yes.
Every time his name comes up, he has so many haters, so many lovers, that it's polarizing. And the thing about LeBron is the media has created a monster with him now. You can't even objectively have a conversation about the guy. If you had asked us and any other kid my age that question of, is LeBron overrated because of this, they would have flipped out. These kids will insult you personally for saying that.
Yes.
Never that serious. Never. And I'm a guy who wanted LeBron to be the best player ever more than anything besides the Clippers winning a championship, of course, when I was young. But watching all these players, it lets me realize that LeBron can be 6th or 7th. Honestly, I kid you not. If depending on
that's
what
not it. Yeah, it depends what your criteria is, like you say.
Exactly, depending on what your criteria is. What universal criteria puts Jordan and LeBron 1 and 2? I'll tell you the criteria. The honest criteria is those are the 2 biggest money makers in the history of the league.
Yes,
that's what it is.
Yes.
It's what similarities do they have as players? LeBron is much more similar to an Oscar Robertson or a Magic than an MJ kind of player in terms of what he likes to do on the court. And then there's no 2 distinct things that make them 1 and 2. They have it. If you want to just do it by best players on championship teams, then Bill Russell and Jordan are top 2, because Bill Russell has won, objectively speaking, this is a fact, the most championships as the best player on their team. That's what everyone seems to value so highly.
Okay.
So if that's the case, then Bill Russell should be 1st and 2nd with Jordan. But you know what? When it comes to Bill Russell, there's context involved. Now you want to use context to discredit him. So that's my issue. Top 2 scorers of all time? Well, in that case, it's LeBron and Kareem, and MJ's not in there. So it's just and if your people are saying, well, Jordan and LeBron are just clearly the 2 best players that have ever played. Based on what? Because that's not what my eye test tells me. Because when I watch Magic play, and I watch Kareem play, and I watch Prime Shaq, and I watch Kobe, I'm like, I don't know if anyone's better than these guys. Like, for real, like, these guys are insane. So when I have that moment watching all of them, including LeBron, that lets me know that the gap is not super big. Now, if you're asking me if there's a gap between LeBron and Larry Bird, both of them, and like Kevin Durant, John Havlicek, Barry, yes, to me, there is a gap. There is a slight tier that they're ahead of. But that top 11 or 12, it's not that much that separates them to me. Yes. So yeah, I do think LeBron is extremely overrated because they try to make it seem like if you put him any lower than 2, you're an idiot. And I hate that. So LeBron's not overrated because of anything he's done. It's only because the media has done this. And what I'm curious to see is when he retires, is it going to be LeBron versus said new player, or is it going to be Jordan versus said new player still? Or is it going to be a 3-man race? I don't think it's going to be a 3-man race personally, because again, too many names. I don't think they can control the narrative as easily that way.
Yes, well said. I mean, one thing I would say on this topic, it could be all the closing things we talk about, is in my actual work, I do essentially esports, which is like it's almost like sports, but video games, obviously. And when we're doing similar discussions, people try to do the same thing, mate. They've got 1 or 2 names and they must be the GOAT player. And they always say there's a giveaway that tells you it's someone who isn't really interested in a cool conversation. They always say like case closed, or like, and there's no dispute, or like, or as you say, you're just a hater or an idiot if you have like their favorite players number 4 ever to play the game. So one thing I would say is this. There's a great quote that says, like, wise men argue or debate cases, fools decide them. So if people are going to do a GOAT list, Like, as this discussion hopefully enlightened them, dude, the names should probably have there should probably be like 10 names on this list. You got to start with the big pool of who actually qualifies, who should be considered potentially the best. Then after that, pick your criteria, whittle it down, get it to who you think is your top 3. And so along similar lines, there's a great video on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, you'll love it. It's where Hugh B. Brown, that guy who's an old coach and has obviously done like analysis and colour commentary now, there's a brilliant video where they ask him basically who's better, like Kobe or Jordan or Kobe or LeBron. I think this is in like the mid 2000s or the end of the 2000s or something. And basically what he does is what I've just described. He doesn't tell you who the best is. He just takes each of the 5 roles of basketball and tells you sort of his 4 or 5 names for each role that you have to consider. And when he lays it out, like we've been discussing in this conversation, you just realise how amazing some of the great players in basketball are. You don't start thinking like, well, this guy's good and this guy was sucked compared to him. You actually realise, holy shit, there's more great players than you can almost ever watch in a lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you shouted out Huey Brown. Huey Brown is someone who he has forgotten more than people who know. Like that guy has seen so much basketball firsthand. He's had the best row in the house to do it. So like, see, if you ask Huey Brown his GOAT list, I can guarantee you $1 million. It will not just be Jordan, LeBron. There's a big gap after. No chance. His list will be much more diverse because he actually knows what he's talking about. He's well-versed in every era. I mean, Huey Brown is one of those absolutely great basketball minds in the history of the game that we need to really cherish.
Yes.
And when he talks, you just got to stop talking and just listen because he is elite. I really have him. I've really learned a lot from him over my life.
Yes. I always tell people he's like fucking Yoda of basketball, so mate. If he starts telling you, just listen, he knows what he's talking about. Right, what about this then? At the end of this conversation, I mean, I'd open the invitation there. If you do the ABA stuff, or maybe when you got like through the next decade, we should do another one, because I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the players from the late 70s, from the early 80s, etc. But do you have a final message for people? Do you want to leave with some sort of remark or somebody you want to thank or something?
Well, I want to say that I'm absolutely down for that. And I want to say this was really fun, honestly, more fun than I expected it to be. I'm really happy you asked me about all these guys. I really get to do this. And I would say if you want to continue and follow me along this journey, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Dime Dropper Pod. I post the cool stuff that I find. And then my YouTube channel, Dime Dropper on YouTube. I want to make film breakdowns of certain games, of these guys. Obviously, it's through my lens. I'm going to be breaking down the tape in like 20-minute videos for each game. But it gives me a chance to explain what I'm seeing to people. So I also, if you want to see the footage in order, you go to my playlist. Actually, no, you have to ask me for it. But if you hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, I'll send you a playlist with all the footage I have that I'm talking about, 60s and 70s, and it's all in order. So if you want to follow me along that journey, you can. And my biggest thing to people is keep an open mind and realize that just because the media is pushing something, like they have an agenda too. Their agenda is to make money. That doesn't always mean the most accurate thing. So just keep that in mind. And there's so many great players in this game's history to learn about. And when we just make it 2 guys or just say everything is better now, it makes people not want to look back at the past at all.
The content I make here on Thorin's side is obviously not my primary full-time job, and as a result, it is made possible through the support of my Patreon community. And this video was kindly supported by Yerka86. Would you like to ask a question in my monthly AMA? I go pretty deep, even talk about sort of life analysis aspects. Do you want to choose a topic I focus on for one of my next solo videos? Maybe you want teasers, find out who the next fascinating but eclectic and esoteric guest I have for Thorinquiry is. Or maybe take part in a private, exclusive, never to be released one-on-one conversation with me for an hour. Well, if so, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today via the Patreon link in the description box below.